Fantastic. Thank you very much, and welcome to everyone. It's a pleasure to be meeting all of you, albeit virtually. And I wanted to share some thoughts just to follow on from the very interesting discussion that you've been having around digital skills. And my comments will be specifically on AI from a policy perspective. So if you think about the discussion you just had around the color purple, for example, where the technology and the business side are seeking to understand each other's language, and the color purple being used to describe that. The policy side is the enabling environment of regulation, of standards, and of wider policy, the ecosystem within which that collaboration happens. If you like, it's the blank canvas on which the purple is being painted, if you like. And I wanted to really anchor my comments, as was said earlier, in this paper that we're doing jointly with EY, which is a response to the UK government white paper that was recently released on AI. So with that in mind, I will share my slides and take you through some of the thinking. If you could just let me know, I'm going to try and make this full screen, so bear with me 1 second. Sophie, are you able to see it in full screen at the minute?
Yeah, we can see. Yeah, it's full screen.
Fantastic. Just one other thing to say, which is that I'm on full screen and will not be able to see any comments in the chat box. So we'll try and keep a little bit of time at the end if possible for questions, but otherwise, please feel free to reach out to me separately if there's anything you want to discuss. So the name of the UK government paper is a Pro-Innovation Approach to AI Regulation. You can find it on the internet. And we are putting out a paper. This is almost a sort of a pre-release discussion. We're putting out this paper next week jointly with EY called Building the Foundations for Trusted AI. So what I wanted to cover was really three things. One is I don't want to go chapter and verse into what the white paper says, but I want to just give a couple of very quick points which might be most relevant from where we are sitting within the ecosystem. And then I want you to reflect a little bit on what responsible AI means in the context of the profession. And then just a few thoughts on looking ahead, where all of this leaves us in terms of where we go from here. So the first thing around the white paper itself. So I think the white paper talks about this language of wanting to set up the UK as a pro-innovation ecosystem. So what they're really trying to do essentially is to ensure that you create an environment where innovation can happen and where the regulation doesn't hamper or stop the innovation from happening. And in actual fact, it sounds like a balance. You're trying to balance regulation on the one side, throttling new thinking and innovation, and entrepreneurs on the other side, creating new ways of doing things. And so it feels like a balance. But I think it's also worth saying that actually the real point here is I don't think businesses have an issue with regulation per se. Often the more damaging thing is regulatory uncertainty. When there's regulatory uncertainty, it stops businesses from investing because they don't know exactly what the burdens are going to look like or where the regulation is going to be pivoting towards. So in terms of the approach of the UK government, it's actually moved away from what we would call a horizontal regulator, which is to have a broader AI regulator across all sectors and use cases in the economy, which is the approach taken within the EU at the moment. What they've done instead is they've asked existing sector regulators, so whether that's automotives or whether that's financial services, they've asked organizations to rely on their existing sector regulators in the context of the use of AI. And then for over a period of analysis and if you like, watching and learning over a period of time, they will decide whether they want to introduce and understand where there are gaps, if there are gaps, and where they would need to introduce specific, more bespoke regulation if needed. So obviously, that's a very different approach. Now, there are pros and cons to that. One is obviously from a challenge point of view, some may say that it's not prescriptive enough. And I think our view would be that there are areas where business needs a little bit more certainty. So I think there are some particularly smaller businesses, if they're going to invest in upskilling and if they're going to invest in, figuring out how they get prepared for this, they're not going to make an effort on their own unless there's a really clear direction of travel. So I think there is a and this is something that we've shared to government in our consultation response, that I think potentially there's a space for a little bit more prescription than is currently available. Also, there are differences. There's a very big difference between financial services. The FCA is a 800-pound gorilla for regulator. Not every sector is going to have that level of depth of expertise as a regulator. I think but there are some positives, which is, I think the approach is well suited for the fast pace of development of AI at the moment. I think the EU were slightly wrong-footed with the way ChatGPT exploded recently and generative AI has exploded recently. And I think there's an element of unknown unknowns with AI. And I think the way the government's setting this up is they're keeping a little bit of room and flex, so that I think they have the option to become more prescriptive over time. And I think that's potentially a very sensible way of doing it as well. So I think that should be called out. And also, if you think about it from an accountancy profession point of view, it kind of aligns with the notion, certainly in the UK, of a principles-based approach rather than having very prescriptive, rules that try to cover every possible scenario that may or may not happen. I think the other thing about the white paper is it puts a lot of stress on both at an international level to position the UK as very outward looking, and also very much with the intention of creating, if you like, a coalition of like-minded allies who, share similar values in terms of, approach to individual rights, approach to data and privacy. So creating that, and also very much with the intention of facilitating interoperability across different jurisdictions where possible, in recognition of the fact that while jurisdictions are national and country-based, AI and technology more generally is cross-border. So I think there is a lot of emphasis and space within the UK government white paper approach for that. And I expect to see much more. And I expect, we at ACCA have already said that to government, and we expect and hope to be able to support that through our ACCA's own very substantial international network, as all of you are aware. I think on the domestic side, there is, something around ensuring that, and the white paper does make reference to this, that we don't just make this a London conversation. This is not just about London and the Southeast. I think this is about making sure, particularly from, if you like, the leveling up agenda, to make sure that we are taking into account the wealth of expertise and also the nature of the need that exists outside of London and the Southeast as well. I was in Manchester a couple of months ago, for example, in something with the FRC or ARGA, as they're soon to be called, looking at the regulator perspective outside of London, and there's a wealth of talent in different places, and it's a slightly different type of person that comes, and it's a slightly different type of conversation that happens, and it's really important not to lose sight of that. I think small and medium-sized enterprises are also a really important part of the equation. It's not enough. I think there's a risk in the white paper approach if you don't have prescriptive enough approaches where it's needed, because one of the functions of regulation is also to create a level playing field and to look after those who don't have the same market power. What you don't want in a very, very light touch approach is for, for example, very powerful players, where, big tech or dominant. We've got no problem with large organizations and big tech organizations. They contribute a lot in terms of innovation. But it's important that small and medium-sized organizations who contribute and who are a huge part of the economy aren't essentially forced into certain ways of doing things, or don't have a voice, at least, to flag when there are issues. And I think that's the other thing that we are saying back to government in our response, that we need to create really clear avenues for the voice of small and medium enterprises and their needs to be recognized as the regulatory ecosystem and landscape is shaped and finalized. I just wanted to reflect, moving from that broad basis of the white paper and where it's at, I'd just like to reflect a little bit on some of the things that we picked out, which we thought, are particularly relevant also to the accountancy profession in terms of creating a responsible AI approach and an ecosystem. One is the UK Corporate Governance Code. So as you may be aware, for the first time in 5 years, the last time was 2018, and now in 2023, the FRC has put out a consultation asking for views on updates to the code, and we think that AI will be a part of that conversation. As you will know, it's about principles of good practice for listed companies across a range of areas, board leadership, company purpose. A lot of stuff in the previous session talked about the role of leadership. And I expect that some of the areas of the code will speak to that. They're obviously read across areas to audit, risk, and internal control. I think one of the key things to note is, the code requires boards to present a fair, balanced, and understandable assessment of a company's position and prospects. And I think if your company is using AI, if you are, trying to transform your business model, you need to be able to understand the impact it has on your company's position and prospects. You have a responsibility to understand it. It's not just a nice to have. I think the other areas around the code's need for boards to have an understanding of emerging risks, principal risks, and how they'll be mitigated through risk management and controls. Obviously, this links to whether the company will be a going concern and continue to operate for the next 12 months. So emerging risks is a really important thing in the context of AI, because sometimes you might have weak signals, or you might have something which is not immediately obvious, but which then later becomes something that really blows up. Or you might be dealing with a range of AI vendors and not really understand what contractual agreements you have with them, and who has what rights. For example, if they are providing the AI model and you are providing the training data, is it really clear contractually what the rights and responsibilities are in respect of legal liability, among other things? So, these are things that will be really important, I think, as we look ahead for the accountants and the profession in terms of the impact of AI. I think the Companies Act, I think, will also be an important thing because it speaks to directors' duties. Section 172, for example, talks about the notion of the importance of a director to promote the success of the company by considering wider stakeholder impact on the community and the environment. And I think Bondu in a previous session talked about ESG, for example. And I think AI is not something which is just about the vendor who's selling it and the customer who's buying it. It involves data, large language models, generative AI uses. It's not like you have a training data set anymore. In an LLM, it's just taking data from the internet all the time. It's all over the place. It's that because it's so huge. The scale of a foundational model is so huge. It's taking data in real time all over the place. So there are really important questions around the public, the citizens, how their data is being used, and how much information they're being given about how their data is being used. So it's really important to think about that from a director point of view. If you're using, either an application directly that has that impact, or through a foundational model like an LLM that underneath the application that has that impact. I think, as I said earlier, there are issues around contracting and licensing, but also issues around intellectual property that directors may need to familiarize themselves with. Because it will be really important if you're using certain bits of data, whether you have actually the rights and the authorization to use that data for whatever analysis your AI model is doing. And also, I think around the business model's long-term impact, this again overlaps with ESG, because this is not just the nature of reputational damage. You can build trust over decades and lose trust with one major ethical incident. So it's really important, I think, to understand how the business model is being shaped for the long term, what that's doing for the trust that you're building up with your key stakeholders. And as I was saying earlier, around invisible and weak signals, and also the risk of black swan events where something really substantial happens, which you just did not foresee in the nature of how your model is being used, whether in terms of bias, whether in terms of even cybersecurity could be linked to AI because you don't understand where the data is coming from. I also wanted to reflect on ISO standards, which are, I think, a really important part of the equation here. There's a new risk management standard that's been released in 2023. All of this information, by the way, will be in the paper that's coming out next week. But the IEC 23894 is a risk management standard that's released this year, and it really focuses on risks connected to the development and use of AI. And I would highly recommend that those of you interested in this space do perhaps just bear that in the back of your mind as you think about risks in your own organization. And it does build on a previous ISO around IEC 31000, which looks at broader general risk management principles and frameworks. I think it's also worth noting ISO 42001 that covers, among other things, the role of leadership, management and planning, documentation. So, there are lots of, thinking that's been done already, and you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You can look at all of these things and really try and understand how your organization can draw from these requirements and guidances that have already been produced. I'd also like to finally call out ISO 24368, which was 2022 one, because it really talks about the ethical and societal concerns. And when we talk about ESG, often we talk a lot about the environment, but I think the social side is also really important because of the impact that AI has on stakeholders more broadly. So that ISO will give a bit of a sense on ethical frameworks, human rights practices, and so forth. I think the risk management COSO framework more broadly, enterprise risk management framework is another voluntary framework that is really a useful one. And I think, the collection and use of data and the application of AI to decision making, as has been noted by some, is a really important aspect that touches on how COSO thinks about risk. It's something which is really important around the leadership aspect. It really stresses the governance structure has to be led by a senior executive. They can't say, I'm not the specialist, not my problem. That's not an option on the table. And I think the risk assessment of every AI model, unintended bias, including unintended bias, portfolio view of risks and opportunities for AI initiatives. So both at the model level, understanding risk, but understanding at the portfolio level, how you're looking at AI across your different use cases in your organization is also really important. And I think board training is really important. So I think, it's a really important, I think, again, there was a reference made in the previous discussion around, understanding the basics at least, what is it that makes AI, for example, learning bottom up from the data, as opposed to setting a top-down rule by a human programmer. The fact that as the nature of the data changes, the way the model treats the data might change. And therefore, that's the learning within the machine learning. So some basic stuff like that. I finally wanted to reflect on IASBA, the International Ethics Standards Board for Accountants. So they've established a technology working that's been exploring the impact. So I think there are a few things that they're already thinking about in terms of revisions to the code, which are motivated by AI. One is whether to clarify, the code needs clarified on whether firms or organizations may use client or customer data for internal purposes like training AI models, and to be really quite clear where they stand on that and what the parameters should be, for example, prior informed consent. I think explainability was mentioned at the back end again by Bandhu, and I think that's been something that the ISB has picked up as well in terms of where further guidance should be developed. So explainability, i.e. how the model reached the outcome it reached, transparency, i.e. where you're using AI or not using AI. And I think, where a professional accountant relies on those technologies, that needs to be made clear. I think there was a piece around the code needing to be revised to address the ethics implications of a professional accountant's custody of financial or non-financial data belonging to clients, customers, or third party. And I think they expect to see some pronouncements in that space. I think there's also a really important piece, and again, this speaks to the board training point, which I made earlier, which is around these need to be in the code, the concepts of transparency and accountability need to take into account the role of professional accountants to communicate meaningfully with boards about technology-related risks and exposures. So very much from the view of how do we help boards really have the information they need as well. So it's going to be really important to think about what communication constitutes effective communication. And just finally, when we talk about looking ahead, so the white paper is great and it sets out, it's been a long time coming, so we really welcome it. And we think it's really important because other jurisdictions are setting out their approach. But we also think that it needs more work in 6 areas. One is statutory footing. As I said earlier, it's kind of leaves it a lot to sector regulators, and it says that we will not impose a statutory requirement at this stage to comply with certain foundational principles that they've identified, but we might do so, quote unquote, in the future. And our concern is that that kind of regulatory uncertainty is not helpful, and it stops organizations from really investing because they feel, you know what, the rules might change, the approach might change. So we've really told them that is something they need to really make up their mind about one way or another quickly. As I said, less mature sectors if you're relying on existing sector regulators, the FCA will be way ahead. Another sector might not be. And is there a risk that the most dominant sectors end up defining how AI is regulated across the economy? So how do they get that balance right? The degree of the horizontal approach. So as I said at the start, they've already said they're not going to have a set of AI rules that cover every sector, but is there an in-between point? Do we need a convening body that has the ability to really understand what's going on across different sectors and really force them all to certain common baseline ways of doing things, or at least convene them to have a comply or explain type approach where there are divergences? So I think there's a question around, do we need an in-between level? Legal liability will be an important conversation around where the liability sits in certain types of AI use cases. They've talked about central functions, which are more of an administrative function, but which have a really, really interesting role in terms of picking up insights from across how AI is being used in the economy. They have an education and awareness aspect to it as well, where organizations like us, ACCA, will hope to tap on the insights we get from members such as yourself. And therefore, we really need to be able to feed into some of those aspects of the central function. And then finally, environmental impact is completely absent in the white paper. I mean, large language models are huge in terms of their energy consumption. And we just feel you can't have a conversation like this and not talk about that in some detail. So I think that's a conversation for the future. Finally, in terms of our recommendations to policymakers and government and regulators more broadly, act fast on the detail. We really need to get on with it because the US is doing a lot of stuff, EU is doing a lot of stuff. If you don't have defined regulation, organizations operate cross-border and they will tend to default to the most prescriptive regulation that they have. So you might end up becoming a rule taker in the UK without intending it. So I think that's something that government needs to think about. Align internationally with like-minded partners and countries, but coordinate domestically, for example, across sectors. Seek multi-stakeholder feedback and involvement. So regions outside the UK, SMEs, it's not just about a very narrow pool of people deciding what happens. And finally, our message, as always, will be the accountancy profession is mature and skilled. Leverage us as part of the solution. We have a lot to bring to the table. The white paper talks a lot about the role of audit and audit tools, and we've picked up on that and supported that a lot in our response to government and said, look, let's continue this conversation and see how we can really ensure that we bring the best practices that the accountancy profession can bring to bear in order to support the government in creating a world-leading responsible AI ecosystem here in the UK. So that really is a short whistle-stop tour, if you like, from a policy point of view. I think we've got a few minutes for questions, so I will stop sharing my screen now.
Yep. Any questions from anyone? You can either pop them in the chat or raise your hand with the little icon at the top. Someone has asked if we can share the slides, Narayanan, is that okay?
Yes, of course, no problem.
You've seen that one in the chat from Sean, looking at the horizon, any thoughts on quantum computing?
It's a good question, Sean. So what I'd say is the computational power is increasing exponentially. So I think quantum computing will be part of that journey of increasing the computational power that's available to us. I think it does create some issues as well as some opportunities. With large language models, they're going to be more hungry, and you might get kind of quantum powered models as well. But on the other side, quantum computing can actually break the basis on which a lot of the security platforms are based, because most of computing is based on a Boolean analysis where a computation is either a 0 or 1, and a quantum can be both of those things at the same time. So it breaks a lot of the existing cybersecurity underpinnings. Having said that, it's not going to happen tomorrow. It's very much out a bit further out. So I think by then cybersecurity will also evolve. So my view overall, in a nutshell, on quantum is that it's definitely earlier on in the journey, and I think AI is much more of a here and now conversation than quantum.
Yep. Any more questions at all for Narayanan? Just a couple of people asked about the recording. So yeah, we will put these on the ACCA website, and then we'll share a link for those once they're live on there. It doesn't look like we've got any other questions.
Thanks, Mildred. Brilliant. Okay,
Perfect.
so thank you very much, everyone. Pleasure to connect with all of you, and do feel free to reach out to me if you'd like to discuss or have any clarifications. Thank you.